ahora la presentación del libro The Handbook of Critical Literacies, a Blueprint to Support the Sustainable Development Goals, Hiding in Plain Sight, a cargo del colega Raúl Alberto Mora de la Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana. Muy buenos días, Raúl. Tienes la palabra.
Okay, so I'm switching to English because of the language. So good morning, everybody. In my case, afternoon, since as my opening slide says, I'm broadcasting today from Trondheim in Norway, but always happy to be part of the collective ELT community and the translation community that comes together for this conference. I wish everybody a very successful experience, whether you're presenting or attending. And welcome today to this presentation about what was a labor of love in many levels called the Handbook of Critical Literacies. Before we begin, I think it's important in light of the event and even thinking about the previous presentation, what I overheard, to recognize where we stand as a community, and that we share the land with indigenous nations, First Nations, indigenous peoples around the world. In the case of TCLN, we acknowledge that our founding members are sitting and standing in lands ancestrally owned by different indigenous nations in Colombia, United States, Australia, and as is my case right now, as I live in Norway. So we believe with our work, we also want to honor these traditions, and we want to offer respect to these traditions. So just to begin, I want to raise, there was this interesting comment in a recent article by critical literacy scholar Annette Willis, where she kind of brings this question about what we need to do in order to bring critical literacy to the next level. And thinking about that we have to think in terms of non-Eurocentric and non-English dominant people. We have to think about Africana, Arab, Muslim, Asian, Latinx, Native American, indigenous epistemologies, and this idea of moving beyond the white gaze to produce critical and socially just literacy. And she raises the question of, is it possible? And is it realistic? And then she goes on and proposes that it is possible. And she goes on to say that that our handbook is one of those possibilities. So I started with this provocation by Annette Willis to introduce the work that we're going to have today. So first, I'm going to walk you quickly through what the Transnational Critical Literacies Network is, what the Handbook Critical Literacies is. Then I'll introduce our understanding of critical literacy and this idea of social responsibility of academics. That was an overarching topic across the handbook. Then, just to get in line with the conference theme, I went back to read the handbook in light of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I offer some suggestions in light of some of them that I thought would overlap with the handbook, and then a little section about critical literacy and language education. In this case, both language teaching or language translation. So quickly, who are we as the Transnational Critical Literacies Network? We are a group of scholars from around the world. 5 of us came together one day and said, we should start something related to this in critical literacies. We started TCLN in 2018. And then the year after that, we decided to embark on what was a gargantuan task of creating a handbook of critical literacies. So we spent a whole year working on the proposal, dealing with the peer review, talking to reviewers. In 2020, during the pandemic, mind you, we started developing the handbook and working with the authors of the different chapters. We sent everything during 2021, and at the end of 2021 and 2022, the handbook was out. A quick moment to mention who these 5 TCLN founders are. So one is Professor Jessica Pangia at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. One is Professor Jennifer Alford at Griffith University in Australia. then Professor Noah Golden at Cal State Long Beach, and Professor Roberto de Brook at UC Santa Cruz, plus yours truly. We divided the handbook in 3 sections. So kind of look at the past, if you will, and some of the current issues around critical literacy. Then we have a second area where we did a global survey of critical literacy. We tried to cover as much of the planet as we could. We're still looking for more samples around the world. And then the final section part, area 3, talks about this idea of where do we go from here? A little bit of the highlights. So the handbook features 50 chapters. 10 chapters comprise area 1, 22, area 2, 18, area 3. We had 108 authors, and 47 of the 50 chapters were co-authored. And for us, that's a beautiful thing of this handbook. A lot of collaboration between the Global South and the Global North, a lot of collaboration between experts and novices. We had established research teams, and we had collaborations that happened because of the handbook. We have representation from 24 countries and regions, from all 5 continents, and offering variants of English beyond the traditional US-UK binary. And 94 institutions are represented, including higher education institutions, schools, and research centers. And as you can see in the map, there is a lot of outreach of the handbook. Of course, there is still a lot of white. And as we celebrate all the green in the map, we still want to make sure that more of that white becomes green, or whatever color we choose for the second edition, if we ever do that, we want, as we go. So after that, quickly, I'll explain what critical literacy is for us and why it's important to talk about this notion of the social responsibility of academics. So we define in the handbook critical literacy as a series of practices that folks need to survive and thrive. From this particular notion that texts are never neutral, and that our goal is to help people produce powerful texts that can counter and can combat injustice. And we also, we say purposely that we draw from multiple critical epistemologies, looking at European traditions, Black epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies from different parts of the world. It's important to point out that as we looked at some of the chapters and look at what people were doing, there are people around the world doing critical literacy, but they don't call it critical literacy. So I think it's important that one of the things we were more interested in was to see what people did. And if people did looked like critical literacy, rather than saying, using the word, but not living up to the expectations of what critical literacy is supposed to be. When it comes to our social responsibility, I think it's important to situate where we are. And as I said, where we are in the world, that as we were writing the handbook, we also overlapped with the COVID-19 pandemic, that we have seen all these calls for fascisms surging in different corners of the world, all this right-wing populist support, anti-science discourses, all these waves of misinformation or fake news that we see sometimes circulating everywhere. And of course, all these questions about climate change, the climate crisis, nuclear proliferation, and how any conversations we have about critical literacy cannot overlook this reality. But as we don't overlook this reality, we also want to point out how important it is to come together, how important it is to coalesce, how important it is to build bridges, to build communities, to build networks. as part of our responsibility as social responsibility as academics. So this foregrounds the handbook. And now I want to get into the heart of the matter for the presentation, which is the discussion of the Sustainable Development Goals, as once again, being the central theme of this year's seminar. I thought it would be an interesting opportunity for me to take a second look at the work we did. And as I said in the title, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals as something that could be hidden in plain sight. And as the quote from is the concluding chapter, a quote from the concluding chapter of the handbook, we think about critical literacy as this possibility of reinventing education, as this possibility of combating inequity, as this possibility of creating and mobilizing resources and thinking of grassroots organizations and grassroots communities and how we coalesce in order to meet those goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals are a tangible challenge for all of us. And I think as academics, we cannot turn our backs on such a challenge. I decided then to look carefully at the goals and read through each of them. And as I was reading them, I went back to the table of contents and I started making some notes about overlaps. Then I went back to the main goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. Then I went back to the chapters that I had selected initially, and I chose some quotes. All the quotes from the discussion about social responsibility of academics. I chose for this presentation 4 chapters from Area 1 and 10 chapters from Area 3. Because of the sheer size of Area 2, I did not review them. But I want to make clear as we come in the conclusion that as you look at the case studies that we presented from all the different countries, it's worth going back and looking at those and seeing what people in different countries, including Colombia, are already doing with critical literacy that may very well fit within those goals. As I recall right now, the Colombian chapter, I'm sure that there are some of the things that I want to mention in this next part, the presentation, that dovetail with some of the things that my Colombian colleagues have published over the years related to critical literacy. So the first sustainable goal, the development goal that I found an overlap, was goal number 4, quality education. The idea of inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities. 3 chapters, specifically zeroed in on some particular issues related to quality education. Chapter 1.6 by Bettina Shea and Susan Cleveland Hughes. Chapter 3.2 by James Chisholm and Catherine Whitmore. And Chapter 3.5 by Phil Nichols, Anna Smith, Scott Bulfield, and Emi Stornaiolo. So the first chapter that I mentioned, Shea and Cleveland Hughes talk about the importance of collaboration and reflective practice. And this idea that we really need to create the synergies across teacher education programs and schools and different credentialing that happens in our programs. In the second sample, Chisholm and Whitmore talk about how the possibility of critical arts literacies creates this push for creativity, for the arts. And we see sometimes that push for the arts and the creative, even in conversations about STEM these days, how STEM without the artistic part, the creative part, it rings hollow. And then finally, in the chapter by Nichols and colleagues, they actually bring up some important issues about looking at platforms and looking at technical and economic elements. And even some of these things that when I read the chapter, they fit very well with some of the recent debates that our academic communities around the world are having related to artificial intelligence. So there are questions in those chapters that give us clues about this notion of quality education. After that, then the next one was goal number 5, gender equality. There was one chapter that specifically addressed that head on, was chapter 1.8 by Navan Govender and Grant Andrews. And Govender and Andrews kind of remind us of the possibility that in this case, queer curricular literacies provides with some of the issues that we're still facing. And we see that the LGBTQIA2S+ communities are facing around the world, and how to disrupt some of these heteropatriarchal ways of looking at the world, and the ongoing marginalization that these groups keep facing in different places in the world. Then goal number 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. 5 chapters. They give us some hints about where to go from here. So it's chapter 1.3 by Rohit Mehra, Sheila Benninger, and David Martinez Prieto. Chapter 1.5 by Rod Petron, Nicole Mira, Steve Goodman, and Antero Garcia. Chapter 3.6 by David Hernandez Saca. Chapter 3.7 by Justin Coles, Roberto De Broek, Willing Sunshine Malone, and Adam Musser. And chapter 3.17 by Enrique Degollado, Idalian Nunez, and Minea Armijo. So in the first snippet, Meta and colleagues, they want us to really look carefully at what we as educational organizations, what roles we're playing, whether to counter the marginalization or sometimes inadvertently be part of it. And so they say it is an invitation through critical literacy to really think of our role as promoters of equity or as promoters of inequity. Petron and colleagues in their chapter, they remind us about, and I like this part, this last part, of this idea that with the academy, we have to deconstruct the power of academic to credential knowledge. So it's what role are we playing to open spaces for alternate voices, voices in the periphery, and even voices that may not necessarily have possibilities to be, say, at a conference like this, whether because of location or because of budget or because of other circumstances. When you look at Nadesaka, his work on disability studies, how important it is if we want to reduce inequities and inequalities in education, we cannot forget about the voices of people with disabilities and the work they're doing to raise consciousness about their struggles and their successes and everything in between. And finally, when we look at this idea of abolitionist education, as Coles and colleagues remind us, it's really important how we counter traditional racial divides and how we counter different deficit perspectives that still permeate education. And I think the field of ELT and the field of language education in general, we need to interrogate our role in terms of how we address these deficit perspectives, in terms of language, in terms of accent, in terms of all the other issues that we have to deal with. And then looking at chapter 317 by Degollado and colleagues, it's important, if we're going to talk about reducing inequalities, think about our role in countering xenophobic discourses and how we, even in the sense, although they talk about these borders as borders in countries, I think it's also important to think about, as we had people in Colombia talk about the invisible borders that are also part of our cities, and how through critical literacy we can disrupt those notions of invisible borders. Then chapter 13, for goal number 13, that's climate action. We have one chapter by Karen Morris and Margaret Somerville that addresses this from the notion of planetary literacies. And Mercer and Somerville, they say that it's important as we think about this notion of climate action. It's how we are creating relationships between what we call the human and what people who do the work in new materialisms call the more than human, and how we are creating those spaces of coexistence and are creating those spaces of like these ecological perspectives where one is not at the mercy of the other, as we sometimes like to think about that. And I mean, the environment is at our mercy or is our disposal. But on the contrary, this notion of how we coexist and how we cooperate and how we thrive together. Then the last, I think the last one, is goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. 2 chapters from the handbook address some of the issues related to the goal number 16, chapter 310 by Christian Adiputra and Lucia Nurani, and then chapter 316 by Rahat Zaidi and Zan Chu. And in the chapter, Putra and Nurani, they talk about this idea of this indigenous, bringing indigenous youth into the mix, and how critical literacy, it's always about finding ways for collaboration with people who may otherwise not be invited to collaborate. When we, again, critical literacy, the emphasis on the grassroots is, how are we collaborating with people we wouldn't invite otherwise? And I think that's one of the questions, if we want to think about these terms of peace and social justice and justice in general. It's this idea of how we give those people voice. Sorry, not just give people voice, it's give them the space, give them the space to present their voices. And then in the last part here, Zaidi and Chu, they remind us about the importance of disrupting marginalization, of disrupting hegemony, and in that way creating other fairer ways to talk to the other, to avoid the traditional othering that happens to I talk to the other, and instead kind of find spaces where we can operate as equals and we can operate as peers and we can operate as partners. Sorry, just quick sip of coffee. We're doing quite well with the timing. So we're gonna have we're gonna have probably a lot of time for conversation, which is good. I wanted to have one section where I wanted to really talk about critical literacy, the sustainable development goals, and language education. In light, again, keeping in mind the central theme of the seminar and the crowd in the community that congregates over the next 3 days. And looking at that, it's interesting because I looked at the chapters, and as I said in the little title there is a long history of coalescence between critical literacy and language education. It's no surprise that a lot of the publications that we have found in many areas coming related to critical literacy, they dovetail with language education. When I did the analysis of critical literacy in Colombia, the majority of publications that are discussing critical literacy came from a lot of our colleagues in teacher education programs across Colombia, from practitioners in Colombia, undergrads already, and master students already engaging with critical literacy. So 3 chapters make this discussion. Chapter 1-4 by Christian Bacon, Nihal Kata, Robin Shell, and Graham Crooks. Chapter 349 by Sonny Lau, Jean Fentian, and Angel Lin. And chapter 311 by Xiaoming Hu, Lilian Pascual, and Andrea Matos. In their chapter, Chen Bacon and colleagues, they remind us about that part of the work we do with critical literacy is helping legitimize the different varieties of language and languaging that come to our classrooms, that are produced in our classrooms, and that leave our classrooms. And that it's important to address that variety in order to avoid a further misrepresentation and further marginalization that sometimes we have because of the languages we speak or the variety of languages that we speak. And then Lau and colleagues remind us about the importance of long-term collaboration and this idea of long-term commitment. And I like when they say, well, we should consider running contrary to the current audit culture and the immense pressure for past publications. A lot of the things we need to do in order to get into this critical literacy culture require changing the ethos and changing the culture and changing the priorities. And if we're going to think about the sustainability of academia, we need to start thinking at some point whether those the current practices are tenable and sustainable and equitable. And then finally, in the chapter, Hu and colleagues, they talk about this idea that how we need to think about extended forms of collaboration and break the silos that we sometimes have in our institutions, the silos that we have created sometimes as a field, even this understanding of fields as this insular manner, and start thinking more cross and transdisciplinary ways and in varied forms of collaborations. Now, just to finish, and again, I'm looking at my timer, and I wanted to make sure there would be enough time for a lot of conversation, and then to return to some of the things I mentioned in the presentation. I'm going to leave you with, first of all, a possibility, and then I'll leave you with an invitation. So I like this quote from the second chapter of the handbook by Trigos Carrillo and colleagues. Trigos Carrillo, Miriam Jorge, and Becky Rogers. And they asked this question about, what if we are not in need of more scholarship? What if what we need is more organizing and more networking? That's a good question. If we want to think about the sustainability, this idea of sustainable goals, beyond the sustainable development goals, this idea of sustainability of our fields and our communities, maybe we need to start thinking that we have to come together for things that are not necessarily writing. Or that if we're going to come to do writing, then what's the bigger picture? How are we going to organize ourselves as a community? And I think about this particular seminar that we have together folks from language education and like different languages, some of the different languages that congregate this Congress. Because I know there's English, there is Spanish, there is French, and there is Portuguese. And then the people who are doing people in translation studies in the multiple languages that congregate through that branch of the larger event. How are we going to start creating those collaborations? How are we going to start coming together as a community? What are we going to do? And that's the question. What else are we going to do besides scholarship? What else are we going to do besides research? How are we going to go beyond scholarship? How are we going to go beyond research? So I like this possibility, this question, this possibility, this what if that the authors provide in this particular chapter. And then I'm going to leave you with an invitation. And this invitation is a quote from the concluding chapter, where I think it's important to remind everybody, and I want to make a quick note here. We were very well aware, as the editors of the handbook, that we tried to find as much as we could, especially when it came to the part of the global case studies. We tried to find as much as we could. We found a lot of examples, but a lot of geographical locations, we couldn't find the examples. In some cases, because the authors who were going to write the chapters couldn't do it at the end, like the case of Central America. The person who was going to write the chapter, she had to withdraw due to personal reasons. So that's why we don't have a chapter of Central America. We looked for examples in different regions of South America, and we couldn't find the people. Maybe, and we say as editors, maybe it's our fault. Maybe we did not dig deep enough. And we're still digging, and we're still looking. We're still trying to find examples from different parts of South America, from different parts of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, more of Africa. Such a vast continent, and only 2 chapters doesn't even begin to tell the story. That just is like it really is the proverbial tip of the iceberg. And we know there are more people doing this, that hopefully, as we said, as we tell more people about the existence of the handbook, more voices will begin to tell us, hey, where are we here? And I think that's the big takeaway and especially with this quote, it's, listen, if you're not here, probably the box stops. It's on us, but rest assured that we're still looking for you. And as we said here, your scholarship is most valuable, and we want, paraphrasing Shirley Chisholm's famous quote, to assure you that there is no need to bring a folding chair to this table. There is a seat already waiting for you, and we do not want that seat to remain empty. So that's very important. If there are young scholars in the audience who are interested in understanding more about critical literacy, and please let us know you exist. We are really trying to amplify more voices and more efforts, and the Transnational Critical Literacy Network continues to move in that direction. So with that, and because we have about 20 minutes, it's going to be beautiful that we have so much time for interaction and conversation. I want to just first of all say thank you. One thing I always tell my students is a comment, is I always tell the students this joke that you can never go wrong if you include puppies in your closing slides. So I always like to include a picture of my dogs, Connor McLeod and Duncan McLeod. If you want to reach out to me directly, that's my email. If you want to also learn more about the Transnational Critical Literacies Network, there is our email. And if you scan the QR code, that is going to take you to a Google document where you can sign up to TCLN, and then we can add you to our listserv. And we are constantly thinking of ways to continue branching out. When we go to conferences, we do think tanks. So happy to continue the conversation. Just want to take a quick word to express as co-editor, first of all, my gratitude to my 4 partners, Jess, Jen, Noah, and Roberto. Some of the best people. I couldn't think of better people to write this book with. They were the best. They were amazing. What a great group of people to work with. My eternal gratitude to all the authors who accepted the call, who wrote 50 beautiful chapters. And I don't say it because it's the end. I mean, each of the 50 chapters is a thing of beauty that is worth taking a look. So I invite you to get a hold of that, check it out, see if you can get a hold of it, and continue the conversation about critical literacy, a topic that it's near and dear to my heart as a scholar and as a teacher. I want to thank again the university for accepting my presentation and for letting me share these thoughts these scholarly thoughts about the handbook that I hope create and illuminate some of the discussions that we will continue to have during the conference and beyond. So with that, thank you so much for being such a receptive crowd. And if there are questions or comments, I'm happy to address them all.
Muchas gracias, Raúl, por tu presentación. Abrimos entonces la sesión de preguntas y comentarios de parte de los asistentes presentes en el auditorio, al igual que quienes estén conectados y quieran dejar sus comentarios y preguntas en el chat. ¿Alguna pregunta en el auditorio? ¿Comentarios? Bueno, en el auditorio nos preguntan que dónde está disponible y dónde se encuentra el libro.
Oh, okay. Good question. You can find it. I mean, probably you can find it online. If you go through most of the major book distributors online, I think they have it. You can also, I can probably share some links. Just probably to look quickly for a couple of links here. Let me just quickly. I'll throw a couple of. Yeah. So let's see. There is one here. Those. Okay. I'm gonna throw a couple of those here. In the chat. Okay. Oh, I love Irene's question. Just to answer Irene's question, well, in terms of organizations, there is one primary organization that is my research lab, the Literacy in Second Languages Project. We are members of TCLN, and we have several colleagues. So anyone who, I mean, all you need to do to join TCLN is simply send us an email, or simply join the listserv, and you can be part of the network. There is no requirement.
Gracias, Raúl. Tenemos una pregunta en el chat. Nos preguntan quiénes hacen parte de la red en Colombia.
I already answered that question.
Okay.
So again, anybody who want anybody. Interested in critical literacy. How can I interested in participating, but how can I contribute? Well, the first thing you'll need to join, and then you can just drop me an email and we can think about what we can do, because we're still thinking of ways to continue expanding and finding ways to collaborate with colleagues around the world.
¿Alguna otra pregunta o comentario? Bueno, agradecemos mucho a Raúl por su presentación una vez más y lo invitamos a seguir contribuyendo con los avances y los nuevos proyectos en estas series de seminarios que tenemos cada 2 años en la Universidad de Antioquia.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Raúl.
De nuevo es un gusto, siempre es un gusto estar acompañando a la comunidad académica. Aunque ahora estoy en Noruega, sigo siendo parte de la comunidad académica en Medellín. Y me gusta que la gente sienta que todavía estoy ahí, que estoy con ustedes apoyando.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Un abrazo. Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.